Thanks. Okay, so today we'll go through Elevation Certificate Section A, and then we have B and C on Thursday and Friday, and some of those other sections as well. Okay, so just some key terms to start out with, just basic floodplain management stuff that applies to elevation certificates, especially for those of you who are not familiar. So the FERM is the flood insurance rate map, and that is basically your flood map from FEMA. That shows you where your special flood hazard areas are. You have the flood insurance study that accompanies the map, and that is basically a detailed report on how the maps were created. The base flood elevation is the elevation that is expected to be reached by floodwater in the case of a 100-year flood, and that is what we regulate to. We have the special flood hazard area, so those are the areas within the 100-year floodplain or the 1% annual chance flood plain. The lowest adjacent grade, so that is the ground that is touching a structure at its lowest point. And that's an important number. And then the highest adjacent grade is the same thing, but where the ground touches the foundation at the highest point. The bottom floor elevation, that would be whatever the lowest part of those foundation is. So it has a different meaning than lowest floor. They can be the same floor, but not necessarily. So the bottom floor elevation is whatever that lowest part of the building is. The lowest floor elevation refers to basically what the lowest living floor is. So like the first floor, the first finished floor of a building, and that would include a basement. And then first floor height, or FFH, that is an insurance term that refers to the rating floor of a building. And so that is, it pertains only to insurance, whereas the other two are more floodplain management terms. And these terms are important to understand what we're talking about so that mistakes don't get made by a property owner or floodplain administrator, because they can be very expensive to fix when you have new construction or substantial improvements. And so we want to be able to understand them and explain them to applicants that want to put in new construction. So what is the elevation certificate? This is an official FEMA document that certifies the elevations of different structural aspects to a structure. And so this is used for compliance and floodplain management and to ensure that it's meeting like the minimum federal, state, and local requirements. And so there can be higher standards depending on what your community has adopted. And so it's very important to be familiar with your own regulations, but this pertains only to structures. So it can be used in support of a letter of map change or like a LOMA application, but those can pertain to just, the elevation of land. So this is a little bit different. It's only for structures, and we're here documenting what these different structural aspects are so we can verify compliance with the regulations. So hopefully that makes sense. And it is required for new and substantially improved structures. So definitely new construction in the special flood hazard area. It could be required for substantially improved structures depending on the different characteristics of when that structure was constructed, what the improvements are, what if any changes have occurred since it was built, and so on. So you have to look at every situation uniquely. And for that compliance component, it has to be a finished elevation certificate, meaning that the construction is complete, and that's what the elevations are based on. Although there are options to do one under construction or based on construction drawings, and those can be useful as you're going through the construction process to verify compliance while the construction is ongoing, and that way things can be corrected if there's any mistakes, and that will be helpful to you so as not to make a very expensive mistake where if the lowest floor is too low, it's very expensive to try to fix that after it's been constructed. So in Kansas, this needs to be completed by either a surveyor or engineer for certified elevations, not an architect. And that's just a state law. And the form is not mandated by FEMA where you have to use it, but there's really no reason not to. It's a very thorough form that will verify everything that you need for compliance. So there's no need to go reinvent the wheel. And also in Kansas, we pretty much always have that in the regulations unless they're severely outdated. So the requirement for a finished elevation certificate is in all Kansas floodplain ordinances. So once it's certified by a surveyor or an engineer, it does not expire. It can be invalidated by changes to the structure, but otherwise it does not expire and it's still valid for the life of that structure until it becomes substantially damaged or something like that, or just completely destroyed. Um, then a new um, elevation certificate would be required to rebuild, but otherwise it doesn't expire even if the form has expired since the time that it was certified. As long as the form was valid at the time of certification, it's good forever. So just looking at this part today, so anyone can fill out Section A, it's just the property information. And some communities will go ahead and just fill out sections A and B for developers, for applicants, for surveyors. And that way you can just make sure that everything is correct in those sections and you can avoid delays due to mistakes. And so property information, and then tomorrow we'll go over section B, which is the mapping information. And so sometimes it's just easier to avoid mistakes by doing this for them, but anyone can fill out section A. And then you have the other sections listed out as to who can fill them out. So anyone can fill out most of it. It's the certified elevations and that certification that needs to be done by a licensed professional. And then section G is for the floodplain administrator to complete. And by recommended, that's a pretty strongly worded recommended. So pretty much, you should always be filling out section G at this point. And like I said, we'll go over those sections later this week. So today we're looking at section A. And so the current form was released in 2022. They did make a small update to it in November of 2023. They just corrected some of the formatting issues that were being experienced. And so there was a grace period from when the old form had expired, and sometimes that will happen. So the current form expires June 30th in 2026. So after that date, you need to check on FEMA's website for a new form. So you just want to make sure that you're not accidentally accepting or filling out an expired form, because then it's not going to be valid. And so after June 30th of 26, all future certificates must be on the new form as soon as that gets released. And like I said, sometimes there's a grace period between when a form expires and when a new form is released. So as long as there's no new form, you can continue to use the current form. So you just have to be aware of that and constantly checking or sign up for updates or something like that. So the new sections that they have added to the current form are H and I for insurance purposes only. And so that's why anyone can fill those out. It's just for an insurance policy. FEMA released these sections to try to make it less burdensome on property owners who have to get a policy to be able to fill that out themselves rather than having to pay for a survey, probably on an existing structure. Like I said, a new structure in the special flood hazard area is already required to have certified elevation. So it's just in those cases where they need it for insurance purposes. So you're no longer required to get a survey for a flood insurance policy, but you can get those certified elevations, and then that can be used to benefit your rating, your premium on that policy. So if it's more beneficial to you than FEMA's rating system, like they have a like logic core system that will guesstimate what your lowest or what your first floor height is. And so if that can be improved by a survey, or if you go out and measure yourself and use sections H and I, they'll take the most beneficial premium for you. So that's those sections. And if you're a community that's in the community rating system program or are thinking about joining the CRS program, these are required and you have to fill out certain sections, and they have released a checklist for CRS communities. And the CRS program, if you're not familiar, is an incentive program that's in addition to the NFIP, where you can earn like points by doing additional floodplain management activities, and then people can earn discounts on their flood insurance. So let me know if you're ever interested in that program or want more information. So you can find the elevation certificate by going to FEMA's website. So that's the link there, but you can just search for it and it should come up. And then there's a secondary link and it says elevation certificate and you click it. And then it will take you to a web page that just says, please wait. And it doesn't ever really display. You actually have to download it yourself. So you have to save it to your own device and then open it using PDF software. So it's not going to work if you have a viewer or a reader. You need actual software to be able to view and edit the form. A lot of people have asked me about this. It was very confusing at first, but yeah, you have to download it yourself and then open it from there to be able to view and edit. So more important terminology for new projects, communicating with applicants when they start a project or when they propose a project is very important. So this is property owners who want to do the work themselves, or if they're working through a third party, or a developer might come to you to apply for new construction. So that's key, making sure that they understand what the requirements are before they start or even submit an application. You will have to help them understand what the definitions are of top of the bottom floor, which is part of the elevation certificate and very important. So that's what we're looking at potentially for what the lowest floor is. Help them understand what is technically a basement to avoid any mistakes during construction. So anything that's below grade on all four sides is considered a basement by FEMA, and that is not allowed in the special flood hazard area. A lot of people want to put in basements, and it's not a good idea for for a high risk flood area, and it's against the regulations. So a basement is always considered the lowest floor, and the lowest floor has to be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation in Kansas. So, yeah, and that's the state minimum standard. Some communities have a higher standard than that adopted. And this might also be a good time to just mention that HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, their FHA loans, Federal Housing Administration, FHA loans now in the special flood hazard area, the lowest floor is going to have to be at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation. So I did just publish our December newsletter with an article about that, and FFRMS. So this is new rules coming out of FEMA and HUD for the FHA loans. So basically the federal government wants to guard their spending against structures that are at risk of flooding. So that's just something to be aware of for applicants that are proposing new residential structures, that if they're planning to get an FHA loan or want to get an FHA loan, that that could be a concern and requirement. So yes, a basement is not allowed for new construction and not for substantial improvements. And if a structure has a basement and is substantially damaged, the lowest floor then has to come into compliance with your current regulations. So that might mean that they'll have to fill in the basement and elevate their lowest floor. So that's another concern to be aware of. So this is kind of the relationship between elevation certificates and new construction. We have to understand what the lowest floor is for a structure based on what type of foundation it has. And the details in the elevation certificate will tell us which one is the lowest floor. And then from there, we evaluate that it is at least to the minimum design standards, at least 1 foot above or even higher, depending on, again, FHA loans or just local standards that are adopted. And so you don't want to wait for the final elevation certificate to discover a mistake because, again, that can be very expensive to correct. So you want to be guiding people through this process, doing inspections, and be very hands-on involved with new construction. So the first part of Section A is just very straightforward. It's lines A1 through 4 is just property information. So you have the building owner's name, and then the street address. So if the address is different from the owner's, personal address, then use the address of the building that is being certified. So the elevation certificate is for that structure, not for the person. So city, state, zip code, pretty straightforward. And then a property description. So this is the lot and block numbers or a legal description and or tax and parcel numbers. It might be a little more difficult to define in a rural area, so you might have to do some digging to get those numbers, but you want to make sure that it matches the address exactly. Um, so yeah, if there's no street address, enter the lot and block numbers or tax parcel legal description. You can use an abbreviated location description based on a point of reference, and that might help you in a rural area. And then you can have attachments to the certificate. So you might have a tax map or some other type of map attached to clearly identify the building that's being certified. So line A5 is latitude and longitude. So these are the coordinates for the very front and center of the building. And so if you use decimal degrees, minutes, or seconds, decimal degrees at least six decimal places or better. Or if it's degrees, minutes, seconds, then at least 2 decimal places or better. And all of these specifications can be found in the instructions for the certificate. And then you need to provide the datum. Excuse me. So FEMA prefers NAD 1983. That's what they prefer. But it might just depend. And then indicate the method used in the comments. So the comments section should be yes for certified elevations that the latitude and longitude were provided by a licensed land surveyor. So they have added this line just to make sure that that's how it was provided, and then how you got those coordinates should be explained in the comments section, like what kind of GPS device you used. So line A6 is to have at least 2 photos, and then when possible 4 photos, and it should be pretty standard as we have photo capabilities that are widely available to have 4 photos, and they want 1 of each side. And so the important thing with the photos is to capture the details and the characteristics of the foundation. And it should like reinforce all the information that's in the rest of the certificate and explain any anomalies. So if there's like a mixed type of foundation where one part is on piers, posts, and columns and the other part is on land and it's half slab on grade, you'll pick the diagram that best fits the foundation. and then explain more about any unusual characteristics in the comments section. So they need to be taken within 90 days of certification. They should be time-stamped and dated. So just make sure that that part is on the photo settings. So you want to have a photo of the foundation that would show any examples of flood openings. So if there's any kind of enclosure that would require flood openings, that should be captured. They have to be in color and at least 3 by 3 inches. So as the floodplain administrator, you have the right to ask for additional photos for detail of characteristics, and furthermore, you really have the authority to ask for any additional information you think is needed to verify compliance. So you should be doing in-person inspections again throughout the process of construction, and then this will verify these photographs. And line A7 is really one of the important ones. This is a building diagram number, so you have the drop down of the different diagrams. So we'll go through those. And so you want to pick the diagram that best fits the building. Again, you might have some kind of unusual construction going on, so you want to pick the best fit and then describe it in the comments, or have the surveyor describe it in the comments. So the diagram number is important to identify and determine what the appropriate elevation is and what floor is the lowest floor, and that's in section C for the lowest floor. So it's really one of the most important aspects of the certificate as a whole, because we'll be comparing the characteristics of these different foundation types to the certified elevations. So the different foundation types are described so that it's 1 through 9. And then this just kind of is a diagram for property owners on how to measure the section H. So these are the ones where the property owner themselves can just go and measure them for insurance purposes only, again, but it just kind of shows you where H1A and H2 are measured on the different diagrams. So they have the slab on grades combined, as well as diagram 5, which is open on pierce poster columns with no underneath anything. It's just completely open. 7, the full story enclosure. And then on the bottom left, you have the different basement foundations. Diagram 6 is a partial enclosure, and then diagrams 8 and 9 are crawl spaces. So we'll be going through the different diagrams themselves. These are a little bit combined because there's multiple types of slab on grade and multiple types of basements and crawl spaces. So we'll go through each one of them. But this is just information that can help property owners when they're just trying to fill it out for their insurance policies. And then this is just another aside for insurance now that we're under FEMA's newer pricing methodology. There are certain discounts that you can get based on your first floor height and other characteristics of your building. So this might be something for them to consider if they're going to need or want an insurance policy and they're proposing new construction, the types of discounts that you can get based on the type of foundation and what the first floor height is. So a building's first floor height is the first floor that is above grade. So the first floor height, again, is the first floor that is above the adjacent grade. So nothing underneath the ground. So we're not talking about a basement in that case. So that would be probably an older building that was built before the current regulations. And so the first floor height would be the first floor above that, or the first floor above a crawl space, or whatever the case may be. So whatever height above the adjacent grade corresponds to the percentage of discount that you can get. So that's where this chart is, and this is the FEMA insurance discount guide if you're interested in looking at that or giving it to property owners. Yeah. So diagram 1A is a slab on grade. So the bottom floor is at or above ground level on at least one side. So typically this is just a plain concrete slab that is poured just on top of the ground, and then the structure's built on top of that. So it's very straightforward. It may or may not have multiple stories above that, or an attached garage, which is another feature that is separately listed in Section A. That's Section A8, Section A8 and A9. So we'll go through those parts, but very straightforward. Again, it could have multiple stories, but it's just a slab on the ground. So looking at these different parts, so C2A is there, top of the bottom floor. C2E is the lowest machinery equipment that is servicing the building, so that's there with their HVAC system. And so I like these diagram drawings. They show you where the corresponding certified elevations go on these different foundation types. So the important thing about the elevation certificate is really just the foundation. That's mostly what we're looking at, aside from machinery and equipment. So slab on grade continued. This is a very common type of non-residential building type, like restaurants, stores, warehouses. If you think of any of those that you've been in, most of them are slab on grade. So this is going to be a drive-through fast food restaurant in this picture. As you can see, it's under construction. And as I said, you might consider requiring an under construction elevation certificate to avoid elevations. It's still going to need the finished one, but this again can help you monitor progress and avoid any mistakes. So diagram 1B, raised slab on grade. So this is very similar to that. We just have a much thicker slab. So usually this is like concrete walls of the slab, and then people will put dirt fill in the middle of that and then pour another layer of concrete on top of it so that you have this elevated slab on the ground. But it is, yes, stem wall with fill is typically how this is done. It could have multiple floors, but again, it's just another slab on the ground. It's not too common in Kansas for residential construction, although we do have a few of them. This is typical for non-residential structures. So on this side, you have the example of a loading dock. So the trucks can back up to it, and the door opening is just level with that. So it makes it easier for them. Right. Very straightforward. Again, C2A is the top of the bottom floor, so that would be the top of the slab. And then C2B would be the next higher floor if there is one. And then again, as you'll see when we go through section C, F through H are determined by what the existing grade is. So again, these older houses might have basements in Kansas. Very common for the older structures or structures that are outside the special flood hazard area. People commonly want to build them in the floodplain, although that's not allowed. People are more concerned with tornadoes than flooding in some instances, but it's definitely not a good idea in a high-risk flood zone. So this is a floor that is below grade on all four sides. So no matter what, if you have that condition, it's considered a basement. So we want to avoid this. And again, any proposals that suggest this cannot be approved. So the lowest adjacent grade is going to be at the bottom of the window well. So most likely well below the base flood elevation, which is why it's not allowed. Even if they get an approved Lomar F, they're still not allowed to build this, and FEMA has put it in the community acknowledgement form that you sign off on, that the construction is still compliant with your regulations for the Lomar F. So definitely do not approve any Lomar Fs without seeing what the construction plan is for that fill. So it has to be filled in typically when there's a substantial improvement or substantial damage is incurred. And we have a couple of ongoing cases that are like this in Kansas. So people get really upset when you tell them they have to fill in their basement, understandably. But those are the regulations. The federal law that we have enacted is that the lowest floor has to be at or above the base flood elevation. That's the basic. And then we have the state law that it has to be at least 1 foot above, and a basement is not compliant with that. But C2A is the bottom of the basement floor. Again, lowest adjacent grade would be the bottom of that window well. And then C2B would be the next higher floor and probably the first floor height. So there's different types of window wells. There is a potential that you could get a LOMA application and take a building with a basement out of the floodplain, and that would help you solve your substantial improvement or substantial damage rules. So if that happens, you could have intervening higher grade that would prevent them from having to fill in the basement. So it has to be built on natural grade, and then we look at that higher grade that's around the window well. And if that's at or above the base flood elevation, it might get approved for a LOMA. So it could potentially, it kind of depends on who's doing the reviewing. It's not a guarantee that it's going to be approved. In the other example, with the loading dock drawing, it could be potential intervening higher ground because the lowest adjacent grade is always going to be at the bottom of that foundation, so just at the base of that slab. I have been told that FEMA does not like it if it's covered in concrete rather than just natural earth and dirt. But sometimes it just depends on who is reviewing your request. So the lowest adjacent grade is always going to be at the bottom of the window well. It doesn't matter if it's covered or if it's made of concrete or whatever the case may be. It doesn't matter how it's built. It's always at the bottom of the window well. So IHG is intervening higher grade. So again, that surrounding natural dirt might prevent water from reaching the lowest adjacent grade at the bottom of the window well and flooding the basement. And so that's how it's documented. Again, a covering is not going to change what the lag is. Again, the loading dock, the lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of the slab, the lowest point that is touching the structure. And again, it's not likely to be approved if it's covered in concrete like that. A helpful attachment would be a sketch by the surveyor or the engineer that demonstrates these different elevations to help the reviewers understand what the relationship is between the lowest adjacent grade and the intervening higher grade. And there is guidance on how this type of LOMA might work in the MT1 technical guidance. So that's a document that describes how to calculate things for a LOMA or LOMA-RF application. And it can be found online fairly easily, but a sketch just kind of really illustrates it. And this particular LOMA application was approved. And so, yeah, we have someone trying to do that now in Kansas. So 2B is a walkout basement. So it's still a basement. It's still below grade on all 4 sides, but there is an extending outdoor area that is at the basement floor elevation. And so it could be a larger walkout patio like the diagram shows, or it could be something like this where it just opens into a stairway landing. So it's kind of this outdoor area that is enclosed by a retaining wall, and it's still not compliant for new construction or substantial improvements. Why basements are not allowed? As it floods, the water penetrates the ground, and that pressure of the wet soil increases linearly with the depth, and then you have buoyancy pushing up on the basement floor from underneath. And so that can cause major structural damage. The floor and walls can buckle in, and that is very damaging to the foundation, obviously, and expensive to fix. And so FEMA, doesn't want to provide assistance to communities that have allowed this type of construction because it costs a lot of money. Also, a basement window could be broken and filled in, and there's just probably lots of weak and vulnerable points for a basement that's in a high-risk flood zone. And so that's why it's not allowed, and the lowest floor must be at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation. Diagram 3 is a split level. These always look really strange to me. So you have the bottom floor in this case is a slab on grade. So it's not below grade. If you see in the diagram, it's a little bit below grade on one side, but there is at least one side that's not below grade. So that's why it's not a basement. So this would be allowed. So you have the bottom floor there, which is used as a garage in this case, and then you have the next higher floor on the right side that looks like living space, and so that would probably be the lowest floor. That's the lowest finished floor. The other one would be considered an enclosure as it's elevating the higher floors, and so that's probably the best use of it. It's just used for storage, parking, and building access. And if it's compliant in that way, we can count the next higher floor as the lowest floor. And so that floor is living space and the next higher floor is living space. So C2A, top of the bottom floor would be that enclosure, if that makes sense. And then C2B is the next higher floor where the front door is. So diagram 4, it's another split level, but it has a basement. So the bottom floor and the top of the bottom floor in this case are both the basement floors. So in this, you can see that in the diagram, that's the bottom floor and top of the bottom floor. The next higher floor is where it says garage floor in that picture. So you have another enclosure there. And when you walk into the front door, you're basically at a landing where you can get down to the basement or to the next higher floors. So this would not be allowed for new construction or substantial improvements because it does have the basement feature, but that's what it looks like. And then diagram 5 is elevated on piers, posts, or columns, and it's completely open underneath. So there's nothing underneath that foundation, it's open. And you can see straight through to the other side in this picture to the vegetation on the other side. So there's nothing under there. So C2A is the top of that elevated floor, and then C2B would be anything above that. So we don't have too many of these in Kansas. We do have a couple of them. They're usually very close to a water source. So as long as C2A is at least 1 foot above the base flood elevation, that would be allowed. And then as long as that structure is properly attached to the piers, posts, or columns, sometimes they're just set on top of it, but they need to be attached to it. And then you can see like that red I-beam at the bottom of that would be considered the lowest horizontal structural member, and it says in coastal. So it used to be that you would only record that it's C2C. It says V zones and other regulated areas. So they've kind of opened it up a little bit where other structures that are not in V zones can use that C2C just for documentation purposes to have that extra feature. It used to be like only use it in V zones, which are the coastal high hazard areas, which obviously we don't have in Kansas. It's just another small thing that they've adjusted on the form. So these are a couple of other examples. Again, you can see all the way through underneath the structure on both of them. So again, as long as those are firmly attached and elevated high enough, they are allowed. So diagram 6 is very similar to that, but it has a partial enclosure underneath. So just part of the building has that enclosure underneath it. And so that can only be used for parking, storage, or building access. So basically a garage, it cannot be converted into living space, as that would typically be below the base flood elevation in the special flood hazard area. And then the elevated floor above that would be considered the lowest floor, and that would be considered um, the lowest floor, even though that C2A, the top of the bottom floor, is the enclosure floor. And that's fine as long as it's a compliant enclosure, it has flood openings, and it's used for only those purposes. So sometimes people will build stuff like that and then try to convert it to living space later on. So you might want to enforce a non-conversion agreement or put a covenant on the deed that says you can never convert it to living space. And then it might be beneficial to you to do periodic inspections afterwards to ensure that is the case. So here's another example. So you can see the elevated floor with the red structure and then the piers, posts, and columns on the left side. That part's completely open, and then you have a partial enclosure that can be used as a garage there, and then the living space is above that. Again, we don't have too many examples like that in Kansas. And then diagram 7 is a full story enclosure. So the entire structure is elevated on a full enclosure that again can only be used for parking, storage, or building access. So you can see the flood openings in this example. So it's basically a slab on grade, it's not a basement. And then you have the top of the bottom floor would be the enclosure floor. C2B would be that elevated living floor. And this one has a little bit more detail because of the flood openings that would be required for this. So you have A8, B through C are the openings with that information in it. And then A8A, so that would be the enclosure part. So it's an enclosure and it has flood openings. So that would be required. If it's used in that way, it's safe and it's compliant, and you can actually see a high water line on that enclosure. So this structure was actually submerged for about a month or something. And because they have been using it compliantly, it's just a garage with a little bit of storage in it. You can move anything expensive, and then it was inundated for that long. It's made of flood damage resistant materials. It has flood openings to relieve the pressure. So this house had no damage. It just had minimal cleaning and repair to do. And so that's why it was perfectly fine. The utilities are elevated. And so that's why we have the regulations in place, because they actually do work to protect structures from flood damage. So again, it was inundated for a month, absolutely no damage. They were able to just come back and clean up a little bit and it was fine. So sometimes you have to get really up close to a structure to understand what it is, because it can look like something that it's not. So in this case, it kind of looks like a full story enclosure that's made of concrete, but this is actually a very non-compliant construction that is like chicken wire with frames and then just kind of covered in stucco with like a manufactured home on top of it. So for floodplain management purposes, there are no flood openings in that foundation. It's also not solid foundation walls made of flood damage resistant materials, which is the very basic requirements for new construction, is that it's made of materials that are actually flood resistant, and there's a whole technical bulletin on that. And again, an enclosure that's below the base flood elevation needs to have openings. We don't know if it's being used as living space or what's going on in there. So doing inspections and having this kind of detail will help you prevent stuff like this. The utilities are also on the ground, and those are required to be at least at or above the base flood elevation, even though there's a stand for those utilities. And so, as you might surmise, this could also be a violation of other building codes that you have besides the floodplain regulations. So, stuff to look out for. Diagram 8 is a crawl space. So, this is not considered a basement. The interior floor of the crawl space, which is usually just dirt, needs to be at or above the exterior. So if the inside of the crawl space is lower than the exterior grade, then you've then just inadvertently created a basement. And we've had that happen where people build a crawl space, but then add fill around the outside of the house, and then that inadvertently creates a basement. So that's something that can happen. Um, so it's important that the interior is at the same level or a little bit higher. But that's going to be your C2A is the crawl space floor. C2B would be the floor above that, so usually your first finished floor there. And you have your flood openings to be a compliant enclosure, and then the lowest and highest adjacent grade. So in this case, it didn't have flood openings, so that was a retrofit that was required, but at least the utilities are elevated on a concrete slab. And in this picture, we're pointing out that it did have a vent, but that's actually a laundry vent. It's not a flood opening. That's for the crawl space. So flood openings have to be within 1 foot of grade. So it has to be at least within 12 inches of above grade and not any higher than that. Otherwise, it doesn't count. And so to be a compliant enclosure, of course, we need those openings to relieve any pressure during a flood. Otherwise, the foundation walls could crack. So in this example, everything is fine except the property owner kept blocking the flood vents, and that creates a violation. You have to have the vents open. They can have coverings on them, like grating, some kind of louvres or something like that, as long as they're permanently disabled in the open position. So blocked vents are pretty common. People don't want animals getting in there or stuff like that. There are engineered openings that automatically open and close, so they can't have any human intervention required to work. But the engineered openings have like floats inside that help them open and close automatically, and then you don't have to worry about this issue. If you don't have enough float openings, an engineered opening can help you reach the required amount of openings, which is one net, uh, yeah, 1 square inch of opening per every square foot of enclosed space, and that's net area. So just a little bit more about insurance. For surveyors mostly, there are kind of instructions to determine the lowest floor elevation depending on the diagram number. So it's just a little bit more about insurance. But it tells you how you can calculate that based on the diagram number and the different elements. So like C2B is the next higher floor, the lowest floor elevation, which you can use for a basement building C2A plus 8. So probably not going to come up very much, but I just thought I would put it in here since you do have these guides on insurance. Again, structures on enclosures. So this is just a diagram with the flood openings and just showing you where the lowest floor is in comparison to the base flood elevation, and you can see it's elevated above that. So this is taken from our new quick guide. So we updated that in June, and I do have that available for anyone who wants it. It's just kind of a handy desk reference for floodplain administrators. But the flood openings, again, help relieve the pressure and stabilize that to prevent it from collapsing. Same thing here, another diagram showing you that, and also that ductwork underneath the floor is considered machinery and equipment, and it also needs to be elevated above the base flood elevation. And then last diagram here is the subgrade crawl space. So this is very uncommon It's not for post-form structures, and you have to have special regulations in the ordinance to be able to do this, and it's only allowed in certain situations, but there are velocity and depth requirements, so you can only build them in certain areas of the special flood hazard area. The crawl space can be no more than 2 feet below grade. And again, this is very rare, and it's usually not a compliant type of foundation, but there are special circumstances where a community has adopted this. And then just the last couple of things here, line A8 is for a crawl space or enclosure. So it asks you what the square footage of that crawl space is. You have to have two on at least two different sides. So that's a yes or no question. And now they've added an NA checkbox just to make sure that you're not leaving it blank. So if it doesn't have any openings, you check not applicable. How many openings, they asked for that. And again, within 1 foot above the adjacent grade. Are they engineered? How many of them? How many non-engineered openings do you have? And then what is the total net area of non-engineered flood openings and the rated area of engineered openings? So sometimes you'll have both or just one or the other. And then we'll take whatever the net open area is for either one or both of them, and then make sure that that is equal to the square footage of the enclosure or the crawl space. And then the sum if you have both of them for A8F. Pretty straightforward. This is also from the discount guide. You can get a discount on your flood insurance depending on how many flood openings you have and your first floor height. Again, you can't block them. This is also a non-compliant cover on the opening on the left side because the slats are closed. They need to be permanently disabled in the open position. There's also a non-engineered opening guide that can help you calculate the typical net area, net open area based on these typical coverings that you're going to come across. So that might be a handy guide. There's also a technical bulletin on flood openings. And then the attached garage. So an attached garage is next to a building. It's not an enclosure, so it's not holding up a higher floor. It's just adjacent to the structure, but it is structurally attached. And so for that, it's very, excuse me, it's very similar. They ask for the square footage of the garage, how many openings does it have, and then calculations for the net open areas for the flood openings to make sure that that is compliant. But you can have this a little bit below base flood elevation. That's fine as long as this garage is used for storage and building access or parking. It's very much like an enclosure. It's just an adjacent garage that's attached to the building. And sometimes it can be hard to tell what is structurally attached, but it's basically a common load-bearing wall between two things, like an addition or, in this case, a garage. So if it's attached, you'd have it on one insurance policy and that goes in line A9, or on the right side, this is a covered breezeway and there's no common load-bearing wall, so it's not structurally attached. So it wouldn't be on the same elevation certificate as that structure. It may not even need an elevation certificate as long as it's been, properly permitted and is compliant. If you need a surveyor, the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors has them all listed, by their licensing and the locations where they are and the areas that they serve. So this is a great resource for property owners or floodplain administrators as it may be. You can check out our National Flood Insurance Program resources page. We have templates, handouts. You can find the quick guide there. We have the elevation certificate there. That's the link, but I can also send it out. And then that's it. We have about 5 minutes left for questions. So this is my contact information. We also have Caitlin Rowell, who is out in training today. But I will go ahead and stop sharing, and then it looked like we might have some stuff in the chat. Okay. Yes, I can send these slides out. Keegan, can you launch the poll that asks people if they want a certificate? Ooh, if there are there issues with getting an FHA loan on an existing home in the floodplain that's not elevated? I believe it should be fine from what I recall, and this is all new information for everybody, and there's still stuff coming out about it. It's for new construction, so I don't think there's going to be issues with that. Sure, I should be able to um, send this out. Let me. Okay. Yeah, I can send the quick guide. So Keegan has launched the poll. Are you a CFM? Yes, no, or no, but I would like a certificate, and I can still send you a certificate if you're not a CFM. And if you do that, I will also include the slides and the quick guide. Um, Let me write that down for him. Okay, yeah, I made a note for both of you to get a certificate. So, um, are you guys seeing the poll? It didn't look like. Okay. Okay, I just wanted to check because it doesn't look like I can do it. Okay, there we go. Cool. So it might be a couple days before I get back to you guys with the survey and the certificates and everything. I'll also send out a post-training survey so you can help me improve these. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow and Friday if you're able to attend for the other sections. But yeah, I appreciate it. And you can always reach out with any questions, or if you need help with the situation, I'm happy to help. We can probably stop the recording here.